Part 3 of the discussion on Chapter 2, the Ancient Near East. That's the Euphrates River there. I just love rivers, so I figured I'd put that image up, found it on the internet. Anyway, a few things I left out, which is that Sargon of Akkad, at his height in 2300 BCE, considered himself basically the king of the world, and then Ashurbanipal in 665 BCE, at the height of the Assyrian Empire, considered himself the king of the four quarters of the world, and it was Ashurbanipal's library in Assyria over 2,000 years after Gilgamesh and the Sumerians that really preserved the Epic of Gilgamesh and kept it being passed down for many generations. Also, now we're going to talk about social classes. You had kings at the top, and surprisingly, well, not surprisingly, right below them, priests and priestesses who were supposed to mediate between the people and the gods, and they were often blood related to the kings. Also, as I mentioned earlier, some of the kings themselves were considered gods, or divine, or semi-divine, which you'll see big time in Egypt with the pharaohs in the next chapter. But below those two upper classes, you had a large middle class of commoners. Basically, they had land and they had certain skills and specializations. Think of like pottery workers and all of that, metal workers. I would have been in that middle class as an electrical mechanical assembler, which of course electricity didn't exist back then. Do you get the point? Then you had landless peasants, and then at the very bottom you had slaves. And interestingly enough, one of the things you could get the death penalty for in Hammurabi's law code was sheltering or hiding a fugitive or runaway slave. Unlike slavery in the United States, though, slavery here was usually if you were a criminal, if you were an indebted individual, or captured in a war. So basically, slavery usually lasted a few years, but wasn't necessarily life, and it certainly wasn't based on race or anything of the sort. In fact, most slaves could eventually purchase their freedom and, or if they did a good enough job for a few years, get freed with getting paid a little bit too at the end. But anyway, I just thought that was interesting about the social classes. Women had a low status. As we talked about in our prehistory chapter a few videos back, patriarchy was huge, and Mesopotamia was extremely patriarchal. Something I found really interesting is that when I think of women wearing veils in the Middle East, I tend to think of post-600 CE and post-rise of Islam, which we'll talk about in chapter 14, way down the road. But actually, upper middle class women in Mesopotamia began wearing veils as early as 1500 BCE. In other words, more than 2,000 years before Islam was in the area. That was just part of what the people would do to protect women. And at the same time, though, Hammurabi's law code had a lot of laws about rape. If a man rapes a woman, he gets the death penalty. And all these laws about adultery, too. So there was a certain amount of protection of women, despite the fact that it may have come off, rightly so, as a pretty sexist society. But now I want to talk about one of my favorite subjects, as it involves geography, which is my very favorite subject, and trade. There was we call it the Bronze Road from 1810 to 1765 BCE, so right in the era of Hammurabi, but further north and further west, 1,000-mile donkey caravan route between Ashur and Kanesh. And I told you I would do Google Maps to show you what that looks like today. And I did walking route from Ashur, Syria, or Ashur, Iraq, to Kanesh, Turkey, which is now called Kutulpe. And now it's not 1,000 miles, it's 617 miles, but there it is, the route. And you can see also, while we're talking geography, look how flat Mesopotamia is. You can see why it's easy to invade, easy to come in, and easy to get out of. When we get to Iran, that's a different story. Persia, mountainous, mountainous, mountainous. In fact, the Hanging Gardens of Babylon were made for one of Nebuchadnezzar's wives, who was probably from this Iranian area in the Zagros Mountains, and she missed her mountain home which is why the Hanging Gardens were built. And look how mountainous Turkey is too. But it's interesting seeing that route on the map. And I know I mentioned it earlier, but the other route was from about 2300 to 1700 BC. There was a lot of trade with the Indus Valley. And I know I gave you a land route because that's the only thing I can do, but you can see how it'd be pretty easy just sail parallel to the coast in a ship. Interestingly enough, this route was 1720 miles, so it was well over twice as long as the land route that we call the Bronze Road, where bronze was traded for precious metals coming from further west. And then this is totally just for fun. I love me some time zones. So pretty much 8 hours ahead of Eastern time, 7 hours ahead in March when we switch to daylight savings. Here, time is consistent there, but just showing all the time zones, Iraq, Syria, Turkey, Saudi Arabia, all in that particular time zone. And then Iran's 30 minutes ahead, and United Arab Emirates is a full hour ahead, and Oman and Egypt's an hour behind. But anyway, just think that kind of stuff is cool. You know, I always say we want to make daylight savings permanent. So this is going off on a tangent, but that does happen in some places. Now, most of this region, it's permanent standard time. Iran and India and Afghanistan, they're split the difference because they're on the half hour instead of on the hour. Anyway, Turkey used to be in Egypt's time zone, but then they wanted to make daylight savings time permanent, so they got rid of standard time, and now they're in Iraq's time zone. So permanent daylight savings is possible. Hopefully the United States will do that. I've been a big fan of this for a long time. That is staying on the summer setting and not falling back in the winter to those depressing early sunsets. But that's going off on tangents. But anyway, just thought I'd give you those trade routes and tell you a little bit about the social classes and the structure. And then again, I love rivers, so there's the Euphrates rivers. I got a lot of river trivia when we get to the Nile in the next chapter. But there's still 2 more sections I want to cover, and that is the Hebrews and the Phoenicians coming up next.